What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. I'm here with William Costello. If you'd like to introduce yourself, tell us about yourself. Many people know you already, but...
Yeah, I'm happy to appear for the first time on Alex's channel, Date Psychology. I'm a big fan for a number of years now. And we're actually here coming to you from my family home in Ireland, where Alex happened to be visiting on a vacation. And we're the type of nerdy guys that when we're on vacation, we like to make science videos. So happy to bring this to you from my family home.
Very happy to be here in the castle. This castle, William's family castle here in the country. It's beautiful. And let's see, we have our little setup. If the sound is a little bit worse than it usually is, well, that's what we have. Would you say this has been adapted to its environment, this microphone?
Evolution is ongoing. We are not stuck in the Pleistocene. It always adapts to its environment. So that's an example of our innovation. Niche. We're adapting to any type of niche in nature, even this room.
Always adapting. So a video was made recently, very high production quality, by someone whose name is Mooncat. Mooncat debunks evolutionary psychology. So this is the response video to that. I'll show you guys here. This is the video, and going forward, let's see what we're kind of looking at here. So this is a 3.5 hour video. A lot of entertainment value in it, I suppose. A lot of music, a lot of songs and singing and entertainment, but that's a large portion of the video, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and we can't promise to do too much singing or costume changes or any of that, but we will maybe interrogate some of the science that was presented. And this video came on my radar because I recently did an interview for a large left-wing platform called Novara Media with Ash Sarkar. And it was one of my first times kind of reaching across the aisle to a far-left kind of channel. And it went really well. She was actually very fair in talking about the evolutionary psychology, about my incel research, and it was a very positive experience. But in the comments on the YouTube video, I noticed a lot of people kept linking to this Mooncat video, saying, "Oh, wow, don't you know evolutionary psychology has been debunked by Mooncat?" So I was like kind of nervous, thinking, "Oh, I got to check out this video," thinking, "Oh my God, I'm worried. Maybe we have been debunked." But when I actually sat through the 3.5 hours, which we did so you don't have to kind of thing, although we'd encourage you to after watching our video, I wasn't impressed. I was kind of a little bit disappointed. It was kind of very juvenile, very ad hominem in style, attacking certain people, guilty of what I would describe as kind of nut picking, using very kind of extreme examples depicted in a very extreme way as representative of evolutionary psychology. And just more than anything with the science, it was kind of so loose and fast with the science that it approached the point of lying for me at certain points. And we'll go through some of that today. And at other times it just had fundamental misunderstandings that are quite pervasive about evolutionary psychology that hopefully we can kind of dispel a little bit today or give a different perspective. But basically the kind of feeling I was left with after it was, for a long time I had this kind of negative feeling that evolutionary psychology was up against an attack from the extreme right wing of like creationists in America in particular, who deny evolution at all. And a kind of a counterpoint to that, I always used to think that the extreme left were evolutionary psychology deniers, or thinking that evolution only applied from the neck down, or just thinking that evolution applied to us up until a certain point and no longer does to modern humans. And I always thought, oh, maybe I'm being a bit uncharitable there, maybe I'm being a bit unfair. But after watching this video, it really was approaching creationist level thinking, of thinking that humans, just evolutionary psychology, that our mind doesn't appear to work looking at the mind through an evolutionary psychology lens was kind of lampooned in this video. So that was very strange. So I'm kind of left thinking, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, but happy to be in the middle with you, Alex.
Yeah, I agree. That's certainly my impression as well. I think a lot of people associate evolutionary psychology now with kind of these Manosphere figures. We'll talk about that a little bit, but certainly they get it wrong on a lot of levels. A lot of what I've written has been on that kind of how the Manosphere gets evolutionary psychology wrong. But my impressions of this video, so she talks about, a good point I think she made was kind of that emotions are crucial in forming beliefs. And this video actually plays on that a lot, right? We're rarely purely logical beings. So we use emotions in decision making, we use vibes, kind of this heuristic decision making that Gerd Gerzinger would have talked about, for example. But it's a really good way to make people believe something if you just repeat something over and over, which is kind of what she did, kind of this mockery of it over and over, this repetition. It's bad. It's so bad. People that are unfamiliar with it might just believe that because someone has repeated it enough. Similar with like ridicule and making fun of something. If you make fun of something consistently enough, that's a great way to signal, here's the in-group affiliation, there is the out-group, they're ridiculous, and not making any substantive arguments in that sense. Certainly she really went out of her way to make fun of Jeffrey Miller, didn't she? What do you think of that?
Yeah, it got kind of weirdly personal at times, even dredging up photographs from Jeffrey's marriage, which seemed a bit kind of close to the bone and low from my perspective. And I thought the left wing was supposed to be kind of like a kinder, gentler politics type of style, but that seemed anything but. And kind of a little bit of misrepresentation of him and his marriage and their open relationship and their attitude to polyamory. And that was lampooned along with a lot of other things. But, there's plenty maybe fairly to criticize about Jeffrey, but I think she went overboard and just went very personal and got personal about a lot of evolutionary psychology, including my own supervisor, David Bussey, who she refers to affectionately as David Bussey throughout. And that is definitely not the name of our WhatsApp group for the lab, the Bussies.
The Bussey lab.
We're definitely not the Bussies.
That's not what everyone calls it in the lab.
No, we never do.
That's not his preferred nickname. Yeah, and Chris Williamson as well. She kind of went out of her way to make fun of him, but she said very little, I think, actually substantive about Chris, who tends to ask very good questions. He brings many people on his show, many famous psychologists from across the board, people with ideas that are contradictory to one another as well, that might be, representing competing hypotheses and theories and that sort of a thing. A very open platform in that sense, but she really seems to have kind of dug into attacking these individuals personally rather than kind of going into their research in depth or anything along with that way. And I think she's also kind of associated a lot of positions with other outgroup figures and kind of fringe figures. I know she mentioned a dog trainer in there. She has Ben Shapiro in there. I think she has, who was the other right-wing guy?
Stephen Crowder came in there. Jordan Peterson was in there. Anyone kind of seemingly right-wing and bad. I think the goal was to try and position evolutionary psychology as some sort of conservative, goal-aligned movement, which is very strange to me because I consider myself personally quite left-wing person. Coming from Ireland, moving to America, a lot of the policies I'd be in favour of are kind of centre-left, left-wing policies. But yeah, this is a strange kind of sleight of hand to kind of guilt by association, associate evolutionary psychology with some bad actors.
Yeah, and like Tara Swart, who's that?
I don't know.
I don't know who that is. We don't know.
I've never heard of it.
These are not people. A lot of this content is not actually evolutionary psychology. It's kind of just been introduced there. Many Manosphere people, I think, will maybe talk about that, but not in a lot of depth. But I mean, evolutionary psychologists are not very happy with the Manosphere at the moment.
Yeah, and that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, so not much of this video was actually dedicated to actual science material, but this video we're going to do is going to be, as we tend to do, much more in-depth science material. We'll try to explain it in detail, technically, and also make it understandable for a lay audience. But overall, the video, it's been kind of a masterclass in convincing you through emotions. We'll try to convince you through facts and logic, as Ben Shapiro might say, although I can't say I've ever watched his shows. But tell us about the EEA.
Yeah, so one of the first kind of fundamental misunderstandings of evolutionary psychology in her video centered around this idea of the EEA, the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptedness. And Münecat seems to suggest that we can't derive any hypotheses about the way the human mind works that are based on our ancestral environment because she thinks we have no idea what that was like. Number one, that's just not true. We have plenty of evidence of what our ancestral environment might have looked like, including current hunter-gatherer societies and small-scale societies that kind of seem similar to our ancestral way of life. If the logic is that the past can't explain the present, we can never use the past to understand what our mind, the selection pressures that our mind evolved in response to, then we might as well throw out all of cosmology. So I don't think we expect Münecat debunks the Big Bang Theory, even though cosmological evidence is based on millions of years into the past. I mean, and making just predictions about the way the cosmos work based on that. So yeah, we have a good reason to think that we know somewhat what the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness was like. Münecat also at other times suggests that evolutionary psychology is stuck in the Pleistocene, so that we think that our mind evolved primarily in this savanna Pleistocene environment. And while that's true, we do think that the majority of our ancestral environment looked like that. Evolutionary psychologists don't think that evolution has stopped operating. It's just that for the vast majority of our ancestral environment, it was more this savanna-like Pleistocene environment. But the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness is not just a set time or a set place. It's and I'd very much encourage anyone to read the Tooby and Cosmides paper, The Past Explains the Present, which is all around evolutionary mismatch and how we can actually use the EEA to make predictions and understand how the human mind operates today. That's a seminal paper from evolutionary psychology. Okay, it's a little bit older, which Münecat seems to have an issue with, but it's still a seminal paper. So our mind evolved in response to that environment, and it doesn't mean that evolution is ongoing. Is not ongoing, but that's the main environment in which we're evolved in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she seemed to have a thing with old papers. She brought that up as if that was a bad thing, but many of these are old papers that have actually replicated quite extensively. We will mention that in the future slides as well, and that sort of a thing. What about sexual economics theory, sexual econ theory here? I know she mentioned that. This was one of the things that she just kind of tried to poke fun at, but what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so sexual economics theory is kind of the crude way to describe it is that women control access to sex as a resource because men really, really want it. And one thing they can do with that high level of sexual desire that men have is that they can monetize it. So Münecat actually made a tongue-in-cheek comment of, should I be investing stocks in my own sexuality, as if this was kind of hilarious. But actually, yes, you could. I mean, like, OnlyFans is predominantly female-driven, male consumer overwhelmingly. And that's not just because we've taught women to not buy sex from men. Men buy sex from women cross-culturally, cross-historically, anytime you introduce any currency. It's because access to sex from women is a more valuable reproductive resource. So the idea is women control access to sex as a resource, men control access to long-term commitment as a resource, and so it can be exchanged in a type of economics, which seemed to not sit right with Münecat. But the idea of market behavior in relation to any mating behavior doesn't seem to sit right with a lot of people. A lot of people seem to bristle at the idea of the mating market, and they don't like the idea that our mating behavior behaves like a market, but it does. There are certain traits that are valued less or more. We compete in it, you're chosen in it, and you try and appeal to someone who's going to select you. That's absolutely the way it behaves, and I can't think of a better word. But yeah, so sexual economics theory, there's a reason why my OnlyFans isn't ever going to take off and be very popular, whereas a lot of women can turn to that and monetize their sexuality in a way that men can't.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sex ratios are a good example of that as well, and the effect that they have. It's interesting because a lot of research on sex ratios, right, when you have a disproportionate number of men or a disproportionate number of women, this is actually cross-cultural research. So one of the objections was kind of a reliance on weird samples or primarily Western samples, college-educated students and that sort of a thing. But this is very international research across a lot of different populations, and we see kind of how sex ratios impact the market in that sense. You kind of, I'm sure you're very familiar with all of that.
Yeah, for sure. And just like any market, if you're the scarcity in it, you kind of call the shots on how that market behaves. And men are typically more short-term oriented, and that was something that Münecat had an issue with as well, and we'll get into why men are more short-term oriented, but they are, and that's a very consistent finding throughout history, cross-culturally. But also, just to pick up on the weird studies idea. So Münecat rightfully pointed out that a lot of psychology studies are dependent on weird samples, which means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And Joe Henrich had a very famous paper that found that 96% of psychology participants in the studies come from a weird country, which just weird countries house just 12% of the world's population. Now, evolutionary psychology is far less egregious on this front. Some of the seminal papers from the 80s and all the way through until the current day, evolutionary psychology papers consist of 30 to 50 cultures, 30 to 50 different countries. That is very unheard of compared to most social psychology. So just to put an actual figure on it, I think evolutionary psychology has a long way to go in getting less weird, but we're far less egregious than most of social psychology. So I think it was in the latest analysis, something like 85% of evolutionary psychology samples could be classified as weird. And that's a problem. We need to maybe improve on that, but it's certainly nowhere close to the 96% for the rest of psychology. So again, I don't see why that's a unique sin of evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, that's something I noticed throughout watching her video as well. That a lot of the objections she raised about sample sizes, weird samples, replication, these are issues to psychology as a field across the board. They're not specific to evolutionary psychology, and in many ways, evolutionary psychology is better. We'll talk about sample sizes. I pulled some examples of that as well, but yeah, so that's kind of some broad things that we saw watching this video. Let's go on now to the next.
One more thing,
yes,
Alex, before we go on the replication crisis. And evolutionary psychology is relatively immune to this replication crisis. So evolutionary psychology, and our lab is writing a paper on this at the moment actually, has a unique style of replicability. So not only do we find pinpoint effects in a lab and replicate them over and over again in multiple different labs around the world, we can do that, but what evolutionary psychology does is we find a converging line of evidence, like a net of evidence from different subdisciplines. So that's a unique standard for a field to hold itself towards, and which is directly contra to this accusation of evolutionary psychology as being unfalsifiable, just so stories that isn't very well evidenced. I don't know of any other subfield of psychology that necessitates triangulating hunter-gatherer evidence, survey data, behavioral data, experimental data, developmental. And there's a really good paper from David Schmidt on this about how we recognize an evolved psychological adaptation and the converging lines of evidence that you need for that. So that's again, evolutionary psychology much less egregious than any other type of psychology there.
Yeah, that's true. Very good points there. Very good. Contrasting evolutionary psychology with the standard social science model, right? Often called kind of the blank slate. You've done this in a recent paper, actually, haven't you? What did you kind of find there?
Yeah, so we had a recent paper came out that found that the standard social science model, or the blank slate kind of view of the mind, when it was compared by one author to evolutionary psychology, it appeared at first to be outpacing evolutionary psychology, and it looked like most people were not adopting the evolutionary psychology lens to their work. Now, we published a paper last week kind of reanalyzing the data there, and we find that there's actually no outpacing, that the two models are actually growing at a similar rate, and evolutionary psychology is gaining a foothold in psychology. But what's very interesting to me about the standard social science model is that it never concedes when evolutionary psychology has a victory over it. So for example, you take something like the gender equality paradox, which is the finding that paradoxically, on the standard social science model account, some sex differences get larger in more gender egalitarian countries. And that is precisely the opposite of what the standard social science model, or the blank slate, everything is learned from culture model, would predict. And still, there has been no concession from standard social science model scholars that the evolutionary view, which can explain this paradox, that when you're actually freed up, you can act on your evolved preferences more so. That's why we have bigger sex differences in gender egalitarian countries like Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. There still has been no concession from standard social science model scholars. And I wager that if the findings were the other way around, that if sex differences diminished in more gender egalitarian countries, this would be shouted from the rooftop as a win for the standard social science model. So it's like a very unfair fight insofar as we keep kind of being more predictively powerful but never getting any credit for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's I see some similarities there, kind of between the way the Manosphere clings to old hypotheses and also kind of to the SSSM in that sense, that when older findings are not replicating, when the evidence is not kind of showing those, they just kind of stick to it and continue to shift the goalposts, which is, we'll talk about some of this ovulatory shift research in evolutionary psychology that has not replicated, but that's not something that evolutionary psychologists tend to do. When something doesn't replicate, it's typically, you move on from that, you come up with something else. But what about modularity of the mind? I think she kind of was making fun of that a little bit, this idea that the mind has evolved some domain-specific modules to solve kind of adaptive problems, and that
Yeah, so evolutionary psychology suggests that we have specialist psychological mechanisms to solve specific problems. Maybe the blank slate kind of theory of the mind is that we have a domain general learning mechanism that learns everything from culture, that it comes equipped with some very, very basic instincts and the rest is kind of learned from culture. But she actually poked fun at one idea that in evolutionary psychology, we never see learning and evolved as competing hypotheses for a behavior or for a psychological tendency, because we come equipped with evolved psychological mechanisms for certain types of learning. So John Tooby, who passed away recently, he had a famous quote where he said, "Students often ask me, which caused the behavior, instinct or learning?" And he said, a better question is, which instinct caused the learning? So we have key developmental periods where we'll learn certain behaviors. So we all have a universal learning mechanism to learn language, but we don't have the same language. So it depends on what environmental input you get in. But this idea of critical windows for learning certain types of behavior is uncontroversial in developmental psychology. So the idea that Münecat was kind of sneering at that idea seemed very strange to me. There's also something about that some psychological mechanisms require activation by your input. So an analogy I would draw there is, think of calluses on your hand. No one would doubt that every human has the ability to create calluses, but you may never need to. If you don't encounter abrasion to your hands, you may never produce a callus. You may never produce that behavior or that effect. So does that mean that human didn't have those genes? No, of course they did. They just needed the environmental input. So we are evolved to learn. We come equipped with certain learning mechanisms for certain types of content. Language is a good one. And learning versus evolved is absolutely not a conflict at all. We would actually predict that that's the way the mind works.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something a lot of people get wrong kind of in the nature versus nurture debate. They tend to think that it's one or the other, but it's always kind of an interaction between genes and environment. I mean, that's considered just axiomatic in personality psychology now. The idea that it is these two things and it's the interaction of them that produces phenotypic expression. Mm-hmm. But I wonder to what extent Münecat actually believes in a real blank slate. It seems like she kind of leans in that direction, but certainly kind of in popular culture or folk psychology, a lot of people continue to believe in the blank slate. I think it's important that they know, like, across psychology broadly, that is out. And yeah, and even things like developmental periods. I mean, this is not from evolutionary psychology originally. We observed these developmental periods, critical periods for learning and development, long before there was perhaps an evolutionary perspective on that. But understanding it in an evolutionary perspective explains it a lot better, doesn't it?
Yeah, and just this idea of the blank slate versus the evolutionary, this is where I get back to the creationist style of thinking. It's kind of like putting things in air quotations and saying evolved or ancestral environment and kind of making a joke of it. It's not an argument. And actually it's preposterous to think of the other argument. It's preposterous to suggest that our mind operates, evolution applies just from the neck down. That just seems so strange. Or that maybe evolution doesn't apply anymore to us, that our base instincts are just all very deep lizard brain that we no longer have any relevance. I don't know what really she thinks, because she never puts forward a clear alternative theory. She just kind of thumbs her nose at evolutionary thinking.
Yeah, it's very strange. People seem to think that we're very different and special compared to other animals, or even that we're not animals. That seems almost to be implicit in a lot of the way people think, even if they probably don't reject the theory of evolution explicitly. When they form beliefs and look at the world, that's kind of what they think of. But it's, you see all of this animal behavior, and then you have to kind of ask, is this due to animal culture, or is it due to animal instincts and their behavior and kind of their evolved predispositions?
Yeah, are the male chimps taught to be desire more sexual variety than the female chimps? Is that patriarchy that's imposed on the male chimps? Maybe.
Maybe. Yeah, across animal species we see that. Much more selectivity in females, much less selectivity in sexual variety in males. And it's certainly one of those things, like you mentioned in the past slide, this is something that is replicated in human behavior extensively with a very large sex difference. I believe Cohen's D of about 0.7 to 0.9, that men have a much stronger interest in sexual variety than women do.
Yeah, it's one of the strongest findings in all of psychology, not just evolutionary psychology. And it makes total sense, because We only expect to see sex differences in psychology when there's a different selection pressure acting differently on women than on men. So men and women solve the adaptive problem of getting food into their body in the exact same way, because the selection pressure affects them both the same way. Sex is such a different animal for women, and certainly was ancestrally, than for men. It would be astounding if evolution didn't also give differing psychology. So the analogy I would draw is that given the massive biological reproductive differences around sex between men and women, if selection gave us those biological differences without any corresponding psychological differences attending to those biological differences, that would be like evolution selecting for a body that's capable of bipedal locomotion with all the anatomy and everything, but no psychological inclination to walk. It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, precisely. There's no question that evolution has shaped the human mind. There can be questions on how specifically it has done it, but we see it across all animals, and that's the case for us as well as, animals ourselves.
Yeah, and those findings about the sex differences in desire for sexual variety, they're so large, like an effect size of a D of 8 or 9. That's like the effect size of the difference in upper body strength between men and women on average. Like those are extremely strong, high in magnitude, highly replicable findings.
Yeah, the way I came across evolutionary psychology initially was studying relationships. I didn't have an evolutionary perspective, and I realized anytime you read research on romantic relationships, human relationships, sex, they're always citing evolutionary psychologists because it's been so incredibly influential in understanding human relationships that there's almost, a very large overlap at this point where it's like you're not going to study sex or relationships without an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, we're a sexually reproducing species. Every single one of us is here today because an unbroken chain of our ancestors solved the problem of mating for long enough to reproduce. It's a big problem, so it's number one issue in people's minds. So the evolutionary view can be enormously informative, particularly in mating, but across all domains. But I'm most interested in mating anyway.
Yeah. So going on now to the next slide, you mentioned this, nut picking a little bit, and here's kind of a paper, I'll put it up, that she used as an example. I think there's only 2 or 3 papers on this by the same researchers, but it was kind of the idea that oral sex evolved as sperm detection. I don't know if I've made a video on this, but I've been a little critical of this in the past. These are good psychologists that did this, okay? So Todd Shackelford, a very famous evolutionary psychologist. I think it's a reasonable hypothesis, and I think this is something that Mooncat kind of went through this video. She made fun of all these hypotheses, like, oh, that's so dumb. So she's just making fun of things. But any question is reasonable. You can make a hypothesis, you can test it, you can see if it turns out true or not. I didn't think it was especially well designed to test that hypothesis. I'm not going to get into the details of why. But it's easy to make fun of. She didn't really explain why it was bad, though. I'm not sure she understands methodology that well to do that. Didn't really seem like it. But this is kind of an example of nut picking. Explain what that is. Is this something that, this kind of paper, is this something that you think is representative of evolutionary psychology?
So yeah, no, I don't think it's representative, but all fields will have some misses, some duds, some bad science, some badly run studies, for sure. So if you pick the most extreme examples of something that didn't work out as representative, of course you can make any field look bad. But the great late John Tooby, there's a recent issue of the journal Evolution Human Behavior that has a series of his quotes and how meaningful they were. And one of the main ones that stood out was this idea of entertain all hypotheses. Many hypotheses that turn out to be true sounded ridiculous at the time and were ferociously ridiculed. And we should try and override that, because if you hamstring yourself only into what is kind of acceptable to consider in contemporary society, then you'll never actually discover new knowledge. Also, it seems to be holding evolutionary psychology to a unique standard in that we can never miss. Like we can't actually, or if we go for a theory and don't find evidence for it and abandon it and go for a different theory, that means the field is entirely debunked. That is just a standard that you would never hold any other psychology to. That's how science is done. You form a hypothesis, you make your predictions from that theoretical framework, and you try and find evidence for it. And if you don't persist with that theory. So yeah, we should entertain all hypotheses. Also, in evolutionary psychology, there's competing hypotheses often, and that's normal science again, but it seems to be kind of ridiculed, a normal part of science that's ridiculed when applied to evolutionary psychology. It's very strange.
Yeah, and kind of like you mentioned, if we look at replication rates and all that, evolutionary psychology is doing pretty well. If you want to ridicule things for their misses, we can just look at social psychology broadly. I mean, do you remember power poses? The idea that, you know, if you did your power pose, then you would be more confident. They were very influential things, kind of coming from this blank slate model that didn't have any evolutionary rationale behind them. Like, why would you even, someone just came up with it and stuck with it. And it turns out a lot of these kind of seminal findings not in evolutionary psychology did not replicate, probably because they did not have kind of good theory behind it to begin with.
Exactly right. So there's a lot of reasons for the replication crisis, maybe bad incentives in science to kind of publish novel findings and, you know, lots of different reasons, p-hacking, things like that. But one is this lack of theoretical framework. And Joe Henrich and Michael Murthy-Krishna wrote a paper on this. A lack of good theory is a major contributor to the replication crisis. And evolutionary psychology actually could be perhaps an antidote to that, because our findings are generally pretty replicable. We don't tend to want to persist with a theory if it's not replicated. And again, yeah, it just seems to be that if evolutionary psychology has a finding that there's this conception of evolutionary psychology that it's unfalsifiable. We're working on a paper in our lab where we actually showed that that's not the case, where we go through maybe 4 or 5 different theories that are well falsified within evolutionary psychology. And that's good. That's normal. You should try and falsify your own theories, try and find evidence of alternative theories. But it seems like people don't allow evolutionary psychology to do that without saying, oh, that's evidence that it's all debunked. And that's just very strange to me.
Yeah. So if people don't understand, you have a theory which is kind of like the broad explanation for phenomena. Then you have hypotheses, like the specific things that you want to test. But if you need a theory, I mean, the theory of evolution is a pretty good place to start, you know, as far as just coming up with something from the blank slate or out of the blue. I mean, we know that, you know, evolution is real. The theory of evolution certainly has a lot behind it at this point.
Well, I hope we know. I thought we knew until I watched this video.
Until this video, now I don't know. But I'm waiting for the debunking the Big Bang.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a hit. So talking a little bit more about the female orgasm and all of that, I think she mentioned as well this upsuck hypothesis, right? That the idea that the female orgasm evolved, because this is another thing we're making fun of, right? Is kind of the evolution of the orgasm. I mean, the fact that, you know, we experience orgasms, men and women, it's not clear that all animals, or particularly that all animals do, or that all female animals do, even when male animals do. It's not clear that that's the case. So we do have to ask, why did this evolve? It obviously did evolve physically. It's a physical process that evolved apart from the psychology of it. So then we can ask, like, why? Why did this sort of thing evolve? One of these hypotheses was the upsuck hypothesis, the idea that orgasm helps to transport sperm into, you know, the uterus, that sort of a thing, to facilitate impregnation, all of that. I've looked into this, done some threads and collections of papers and all of that. I think there's maybe good evidence against that being the case, but she didn't seem to explain that either, did she? She just kind of made fun of this upsuck thing, and I think she said upsuck in a funny way, and everyone laughed.
And again, just kind of whatever about what actually turns out to be maybe true, or the best evidence kind of suggests about the function of female orgasm, that's complicated, and researchers should get into the weeds about that to try and figure it out. She didn't suggest any hypotheses of her own, certainly. But the idea, she said that there's about 15 different evolutionary explanations for this, and they're all debunked. And it's like, yeah, okay, good. We're trying to come up with theories. It's a bit of a puzzle. It's not a straightforward explanation for why it would exist. You know, it's not clear that it exists in other mammals, so... Yeah,
it's easy to make fun of things and debunk them. It's harder to come up with good explanations and demonstrate those through the scientific method and all of that. So I think there is stronger evidence at the moment for kind of a pair bonding function for the female orgasm, right? That the orgasm can help to select mates during the sexual process, that sort of a thing, and also to retain mates long term. And I mean, this is something, you know, it's interesting because I think people coming more maybe from a left-wing perspective or even a blank slate perspective, they'd say, why don't you ask women what they think and all of that? And I mean, if you ask women, you know, are you more likely to stay in a relationship with someone who gives you orgasms consistently or not? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of evidence for that, you know, that we see women orgasm at much higher rates when they are in long-term committed relationships as opposed to just during hookups and that sort of a thing. Mm-hmm. What do you think about, perhaps, what's the most convincing explanation for you for the female orgasm?
I think certainly, and Münecat even suggested it. It's like, why don't you maybe think about a partner who listens to what their partner wants and what they likes in bed. All those are cues to good long-term mating qualities. And that's all we have as animals in this world, is picking up cues to qualities. So certainly, yeah, the ability to figure out what gives my partner an orgasm requires a lot of long-term mating qualities. So I think it's certainly, that makes sense to me. But
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And so she's just kind of making fun of things. She's like, well, maybe the clitoris is just for pleasure. I mean, evolutionary psychologists don't deny that the clitoris is for pleasure, but you have to ask, like, why did we evolve an organ for pleasure? What is the function of that? What is the purpose of that? Why do we have it? Why do some animals not have it? Why do some animals probably, have a clitoris but maybe not experience orgasm, but others do? Even why is there individual variation in orgasm between women, that some can achieve orgasm much more easily, others cannot, et cetera, et cetera?
And ironically, just saying, oh, well, it's there for pleasure is kind of a just so story, right? It's just so. We just have a clitoris for pleasure. Well, we don't. I don't. But
Yeah, it just happened to happen. And I mean, that's even one of the evolutionary explanations for it, is that the clitoris is essentially vestigial. It's just there. It doesn't have any function at all. Maybe it just serves for pleasure now. But yeah, it is really just kind of a just so story there. But yeah, that's something throughout her video, I think, is that she offers very few alternative explanations, which is kind of typical of people that are trying to debunk something instead of trying to kind of contribute to the body of knowledge more broadly.
Yeah.
Let's go on now and see what else we have here. So certainly at the beginning of her video and all throughout it, she kind of makes these links between evolutionary psychology and the manosphere. My kind of big thing, and it's not what I set out intending to do, but it's certainly become that, is kind of like, how does the manosphere get evolutionary psychology wrong? So certainly I'm not a big fan of manosphere, black pill, red pill. A lot of the time I take to devote, if people have seen the website, is explaining what they get wrong about these things. So there's a lot of conflating that. What do evolutionary psychologists kind of think about the manosphere and all of these pills at the moment?
Yeah, so we essentially think that they're maybe bastardizing a lot of our findings. So one major point of contention is that red pill gurus don't accept that evolutionary psychology, or many evolutionary psychologists, move on from the dual mating hypothesis to the mate switching hypothesis. And, Münecat seemed to criticize evolutionary psychology for doing that as well. So she's in a strange bedfellow with Manosphere content creators there, which is maybe news to her. But so essentially, the dual mating hypothesis was a totally a hypothesis that makes sense theoretically, a logical one, that women would mate with one person for long-term mating and mate with another man for short-term mating. Kind of have this dual sexuality framework. Because you do see that in other ape species as well, like chimpanzees. But it turned out to be not well evidenced. And there was theories that the ovulatory shifts, that when women are ovulating, their preferences for different type of men would come online. And again, the accumulating evidence didn't point towards that. So we began to notice that the evidence, or David, my supervisor, began to notice that the evidence favored more of the mate switching hypothesis. That is, when women commit infidelity, that it's typically with a view to move to a different relationship. They fall in love with their affair partners, they're unhappy in their own relationship as a motive for the infidelity, and that's not the case for men. So the evidence seemed to suggest a more mate-switching hypothesis. But again, this is a fundamental difference between evolutionary psychologists and the manosphere, who persist with the dual mating hypothesis. So it's evolutionary psychologists that debunk their own theory of the dual mating, so like good scientists should do. So I don't know what that says about how evolutionary psychology is operating, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of this association with the manosphere and pulling these people out. It's almost like if we picked the most extreme examples of left-wing thought or whatever and said, this is what it is. It's, well, like you said, kind of like nut picking there. So let's see, let's go on here. So she does kind of do a lot of mockery throughout this video and all of that. We mentioned the developmental periods, kind of mockery of that is something that was well observed even before taking an evolutionary perspective and all of that. I think some as well that she kind of mocked is kind of related to your research on incels and monogamy. What was that? Do you remember?
Yeah, so she kind of seemed to thumb her nose at this idea that one of the main cultural advantages of monogamy is that it results in a more egalitarian distribution of mates. Historically, we have a deep ancestral history of polygyny, meaning like the most high status man, preferential polygyny, whereby the most high status man in a society would accumulate more wives, multiple wives, and that would inevitably mean there's more incels. Some men would be left out. As cultures got more complex, cultures that began to practice a cultural norm of monogamy, meaning that there were fewer incels, they began to flourish more than the ones that persisted with polygyny. Now, bear in mind, we have 83% of human societies ever recorded have been preferentially polygynous. Now, most mateships in those societies were monogamous. Most men could not accumulate enough resources to support multiple wives. But it's an uncontroversial finding in evolutionary psychology, in cross-cultural psychology, in anthropology, that monogamy, one of the main cultural advantages is fewer incels, essentially, because incels are very troublesome in your society. So one very civilizing force on them is actually getting married. So, that is whether it's very palatable or not, it is a historical fact. I mean, that's an uncontroversial finding in anthropology.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense, doesn't it? It was funny because she also kind of took some time to mock a passage actually from Charles Darwin about the peacock's tail. Darwin, she says, he was obsessed with this peacock's tail, and so was Geoffrey Miller. And that was with the wedding photos actually of his wife. He put up because she wore a peacock's tail feather, I think, in her headdress or something like that. Which is, I mean, that's a cute thing to do, but who knows? Maybe they don't like cute things. They don't like when people get married and love each other. I guess. But I don't know. So. This is not even evolutionary psychology. This is just kind of evolution more broadly. The idea of sexual selection, right? What is sexual selection? Darwin and the peacock's tail. What do you think?
So the peacock's tail is said to have made Charles Darwin physically sick because it didn't fit with his first big theory of natural selection, of survival of the most adapted, the kind of most fit for their environment. A peacock's tail is very costly to produce, metabolically costly, and it's like a neon light advertising yourself to predators. So it's like, why, Darwin wrestled with this thought, why would selection have favored a peacock to produce such a thing? And it led him to his second theory of sexual selection, that the female peahen just really likes the feathers. So certain traits are evolved primarily because they're favored by the female sex. The mind of one sex shapes the body and mind of the other. It's constantly in coevolution. So, this idea of the peacock's tail once upon a time was an evolutionary puzzle to Darwin. He didn't shy away from it. He engaged with it, and it led to one of the other strongest theories he's ever produced. So, there's a lesson there that evolutionary psychology shouldn't shy away from puzzles like exclusive homosexuality, things like that. We should follow in Charles Darwin's footsteps and kind of embrace the puzzle and try and figure it out.
Yeah, this kind of mockery of sexual selection, this is of course now a part of the theory of evolution more broadly. We see it across animals, and she spent a lot of time kind of mocking mate preferences in general, especially at the beginning, like, oh, I like your scent or whatever. But certainly, we see mate preferences across all animal species, that some individuals are preferred, some are not. Sometimes we know why, very often we do, sometimes we don't. And I mean, human beings have these mate preferences as well. We can observe them and quantify them without getting into all of what those are. It's kind of almost taking offense to the idea that people have mate preferences, that some people are more desirable than others and all of that. But I mean, this is a part of evolution, this evolution of mate preferences, and it's very, very robust in that sense. I guess some of those mate preferences, for example, something really robust in evolutionary psychology is this female desire to select mates who have traits that would make them good long-term fathers. I mean, do you think that's something that she would deny, that women want men who would be good fathers, for example, those kinds of traits?
It seems adaptive. I mean, our female ancestors who selected mates that didn't have traits for being good fathers had less fitness than the ones that selected mates with good long-term qualities. And these mate preferences, crucially, they're not arbitrary. Right? No species makes arbitrary mate preferences, really. They're ones that over ancestral time, we inherited the preferences of our ancestors who had greater fitness. So men who selected fertile women had greater fitness than those who didn't. One cue to fertility was youth. That shows up in a very clear evolutionary prediction about what male mate preferences might be like. Absolutely, an evolutionary lens can help you make sense of what otherwise might seem arbitrary mate preferences. But I always wonder when people think about, they thumb their nose at the evolutionary view of mate preferences, I wonder, how do they make their mate preferences? How do they choose their mates? Just randomly, arbitrarily? What matters to them? And I wager it would be the similar evolutionary things, but they would just say that it matters for a different reason.
Yeah, they would just come up kind of with their own folk psychology explanation for it in that sense. But I mean, this research on mate preferences, what women desire in short and long-term relationships, that's early research in evolutionary psychology, some of the most robust and well-replicated research across cultures as well. I guess another thing that she was kind of mocking was kind of this evolution of cooperative behavior. What do you think of that?
Yeah, and that seems strange, as if she suggested that, well, we're obviously a very social species, and it's like, yes, but yeah, that's why a cooperative tendency would evolve and be selected for and help us actually become the dominant species on Earth, is this sociality. And you do find that the more social other species are, the closer they are to us in line, the more social they are too. So very obvious evolutionary history of that. And that's kind of one thing of what it means to be uniquely human, is this ability to cooperate. So I don't know why the evolutionary history of cooperation, which just seems so obvious to me, I don't know why that would be even cast aspersions on.
Yeah, these are very strange things. These are almost kind of like the things the Manosphere mocks about evolutionary psychology when you tell them and you say, actually, prosocial behavior is selected for. We're a very prosocial species. We have an enormous capacity for cooperation. We build very complex cooperative structures as opposed to many animals that don't. And, you have to ask, like, why do those animals not do it? Why do we do it? Well, obviously, we're a different species. We've evolved differently. That our behavior has evolved in that sense as well.
I just wait one more point on the mate preferences as well. It's an area of sexual psychology where we see fairly large sex differences. Yes. Both sexes like kindness and intelligence in a partner, but there are some key differences. And guess where you find those differences? Where each sex face different selection pressures in their ancestral environment. Men face the adaptive pressure of choosing fertile mates. Women's fertility declines more sharply than men's. So it's a sex-differentiated selection pressure. Therefore, in response to that selection pressure, our ancestors who preferred fertile mates used youth as a cue to that fertility. They're the preferences we inherited. Yeah. On the other hand, women preferred higher status mates who could provision her and her offspring with resources. They preferred taller mates who could keep them safe from the hostile forces of nature. That so many predictions and facts of mate preferences can be explained by these different selection pressures.
Mm-hmm. And this is a sexual strategies theory. What you're explaining here, or part of it at least, the idea that when pressures are similar, when we face similar challenges, men and women, then we see smaller sex differences. When the pressures are different, that's when we see larger sex differences there. And that's the theoretical background for this, and the hypotheses to test that. Like, do we see, a difference in a preference for earning or income potential or education? That's where we see these large sex differences that's consistent with that. So kind of validating that theory.
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's see. Yeah, there's room for kind of critiques of these hypotheses and all of this, but in critiquing some of these, specific things, this nut picking, she swept up some pretty basic, tenets, key features, not just of evolutionary psychology, but of evolution broadly.
Yeah, and there was a kind of a weird, even when she brought up Charles Darwin, she was kind of like, who I would consider maybe one of the greatest scientists of all time, what a contribution to life, intellectual life, and our understanding of who we are in the universe, how we got here, what it means to be human. And she's kind of like lampooning him, introducing him as this old white grandpa type thing. And I don't know, is this just kind of in vogue to criticize old white men? So Charles Darwin is one? I don't know, yeah.
That nut, Charles Darwin, evolution.
Crazy.
Who knows, we're creationists now. So kind of what we mentioned in some past slides, she seems to make a lot of the same errors as the Manosphere as far as thinking about these things. Kind of maybe thinking non-replication is bad or something like that. About status hierarchy, I think she said status hierarchy is fixed at one point. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, at the very outset of the video, she seemed to kind of link that conservatives would use evolutionary psychology as a defending of their worldview. And one naturalistic fallacy that she committed was suggesting that evolutionary psychology contends that status hierarchies are fixed and that there's nothing you can do to change your position in that hierarchy. She thinks that that's the position of the conservatives and that that's the position of the evolutionary psychologists. But it's precisely the opposite. We always talk about status hierarchies as being constantly traversed, and we look at the things you can do to traverse those hierarchies and what contributes to it. It's actually almost a very incel-like black pill thinking of, evolutionary psychology thinks you're fixed. Precisely the opposite. Even something like mate value, we always talk about how you can increase your mate value or it can decrease. We never look at something as totally fixed. And this idea of the naturalistic fallacy that evolutionary psychology describing human nature make the contention that, that's the way we should be. There's tons of examples of how we necessarily override our evolved nature all the time. You get road rage in the car. you shouldn't act on it, right? It's not right that you get road rage. You should try and quell that down. We do that all the time. So the only way to override your some negative evolved tendencies is to understand them by investigating them. Denying that they're there or their evolutionary roots is really harmful because it just kind of hamstrings you and you can't actually overcome anything then. You're kind of stuck. You're tramlined.
Yeah, that's interesting, kind of that overriding bit. I think a lot of discourse on jealousy is like that, where if people feel jealousy, they think this is incredibly toxic and it needs to be overridden. They'll be like, go work on yourself. And it's like, but jealousy also probably has some important roots, and it's not always the case that it's necessarily a bad thing. Being aware of jealousy and what induces it and when it is bad and when it is kind of good, and, you know, having an accurate mental map of the world helps you kind of make sense of the world and your own feelings and all of that. If you don't have that accurate mental map, then you're confused by yourself in that sense.
Yeah, even some feelings like depression and anxiety. There's great work in evolutionary medicine and evolutionary psychiatry now on the adaptive roots of depression and anxiety. There's a really good book by Randolph Nesse called Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, that it talks about how these feelings evolved over time and why they persist with us, what they were for, what the function was, and why they maybe are misfiring in the modern world where they're maybe not as appropriate. It's this idea of evolutionary mismatch where the world that we see around us is radically different from the environment in response to which our psychology evolved. And understanding the ways in which it is very different can be very informative about some kind of maladaptive uses of our psychology.
Yeah, that's a good point, because now we're moving away from mating preferences to other things like emotions. So a lot of the time when people criticize evolutionary psychology or this or that, they're very kind of embroiled in kind of like this gender discourse where it's like, I hate women, I hate men, man bad, no, woman bad. And they go back and forth like that. But evolutionary psychology touches on many things, such as the evolution of emotions. Why did we evolve to feel this in contexts that have nothing to do with like mate selection or anything like that? Don't see that she mentioned any of that in this video. I don't know to what extent she would be familiar with that or even be able to critique it, but I mean, everything that you feel has evolved for a reason in that sense.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but that's the thing is she zeroed in on some topics. I think she guessed she could lampoon, but ignored a lot of other things that evolutionary psychology has to say about.
Yeah, she ignored an enormous amount of that. Some of these very well replicated things are totally unrelated to mating preferences. We'll mention that in another slide as well. A quote that I wrote this down. It was a quote. She said, evolutionary, this was I think in reference to the non-replications of the ovulatory shift hypothesis and going on to the mate switching hypothesis, like you described. She said, evolutionary psychology is going back on its original hypothesis when new evidence comes to light. Like, this is supposed to be a bad thing, that it's going back on the hypothesis. So something the Manosphere notoriously does with this dual mating hypothesis, like that's become kind of like you said, a bastardization of it, has become kind of like this fixture for alphas and betas. They've twisted into this weird thing. But that's the scientific method right there. The idea that, okay, you have a hypothesis, you test it. If the hypothesis is not confirmed in your test, if you're not able to replicate it, you move on. It's not a bad thing to do that, to go back against your original hypothesis. You're supposed to kind of maybe discard that and rethink things if it comes out. This is, the way that a lot of people think, though. It's not well informed, I guess, by the scientific method. This idea that you can never be wrong, you can never change your mind or anything. Scientists should be open to being wrong and changing their mind and testing things that they think, okay, that could be right, it could be wrong, I don't really know. But being very comfortable with saying that was wrong, discard it, go on to the next thing there.
Yeah, that's the scientific method. You correct for yourself, yeah, for sure.
Let's see, let's go on now and see what else we're looking at. So, as we mentioned, some of this ovulatory shift research, this was probably what she talked about as far as like actual research. This is probably what she spent most of the time on. If she researched this making her video, I'd be surprised if she didn't come across my own articles on it, because they come up at the top of search results. This ovulatory shift hypothesis, the idea that across the woman's cycle, she has a shift in mating preferences, right? So a preference for more masculine faces, for example, when a woman is ovulating. A lot of this research, of course, has not replicated. I've made videos on this and written articles about it. I've kind of rung this bell that hasn't replicated quite extensively myself. And I guess there's a question here. When she asks, like, this has not replicated, who are the people that are running these replications and not replicating? Who are they?
Also evolutionary psychologists.
They're also evolutionary psychologists. It's not like blank slatists coming from some other paradigm that are running these replications. It's evolutionary psychologists with other hypotheses, and they're saying, okay, maybe these shifts aren't real, or maybe they're very small or conditional, But it's only evolutionary psychologists testing this and running these replications.
Yeah, and the theoretical framework for the ovulatory shift makes a lot of sense. We see a lot of chimps have something similar, where when the female is in estrus, that's when you see sexual behavior. The male chimps would largely ignore the female when she's not ovulating. So it's reasonable to suggest there'd be some relic of this in humans, and when you go looking for evidence, if you don't find the evidence and it doesn't support your hypothesis, you move on. That's normal science.
Exactly, yeah. And in some of these replications, there's evidence like, okay, so shifts toward facial masculinity, maybe not. Some other things like higher libido, that's extremely well replicated.
Yeah.
That women experience higher libido when they're ovulating. So we know that ovulation has some effects on human psychology. That's not something that doesn't replicate. That's very, very robust. So it's some of these specific shifts in mate preferences. And what's interesting is like, these are not that crucial like to your worldview. Like, does it really matter if women like men a little bit more, who are a little bit more facially masculine when they're ovulating? It's weird that that's become kind of a fixture of the manosphere as well, because it's not that important of a finding.
Yeah, which is the morally suspect the hypothesis, the mate switching or the dual mating? I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny too, because in the manosphere they're like, they want to suppress this because they can't let it get out. That's why it's not replicating. And it's like, it's not that controversial. It's not that big of a deal.
They only knew how science works and how we're not that coordinated to run a conspiracy like that, for sure.
Yeah, and so she doesn't propose alternative explanations, but like, what would the blank slate explanation be for the rise of libido when a woman is ovulating? Like, why would hormones shift human behavior and human psychology in certain ways?
I don't know what a hypothesis might be, but it would have to be a just so story, because it would be just making up something out of the blue. These predictions or these theories about why that might be the case, you can make arguments based on a theoretical evolutionary framework that you may or may not find data for. Normal science, I don't know what the theoretical framework would be for that.
I have not even heard like an alternative explanation for like an increase in libido during ovulation. Some things they can attribute, to like, it's patriarchy. They learned it. You did not learn to be hornier when you're ovulating.
Yes.
That's not a part of it. That doesn't even make sense, does it?
Here's another one. Women are far greater in sexual disgust than men. And that's for a good evolutionary reason. They're far more at risk of STDs, have a lot more to lose from sex in general. So, yes, as we would predict, they have an evolved psychology for greater sexual disgust. Try explaining that by patriarchy. When were women taught to be more sexually disgusted? Or actually, when are they taught to actually be more at risk of STDs in their biology? So is that patriarchy? Or evolution is very patriarchal, I guess.
It's a very patriarchal force of nature. There's a lot in evolutionary psychology that does not lend itself well to patriarchy, which we can talk about this in another slide. It's also kind of a just so story in itself in many ways. But she mentions this as well, and I think this is kind of another maybe failure to understand psychology and science in general and research. She talks about these old studies, and she says, look, these are old studies. Look how old this PDF is, as if something is old. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in psychology, we're kind of taught if there's a seminal theoretical contribution, you cite the theoretical first seminal paper. And some of these old papers are replicated. They're very robust, first of all, and they're replicated time and time again. So the mate preferences studies that David Buss did in 1989, first of all, extremely non-weird, 37 different cultures, thousands of participants from all over the world, finding a large degree of universality in mate preferences, recently replicated with an even larger cross-cultural sample by Katie Walter in 2020. And, what best practice, I think, in my citation is to cite the original and then cite the most up-to-date evidence. But some of these findings, like, for example, the sex differences in desire for sexual variety, they've been replicated so many times that it would be almost impossible to cite them all. You'd have pages upon pages. My supervisor, David Buss, he calls them the most boring replications in all of psychology. We find them, again, by accident when we're looking for other things. Citing something old and seminal isn't an indictment on its quality. It may be that the theories have moved on, but in the case of mate preferences, it hasn't really. We find it replicated time and time again.
Yeah, in that paper specifically by David Buss in 1989, this has been cited about 6,000 times. To give an example, the papers that Kahneman and Tversky won the Nobel Prize for was cited about 50,000 times. The average number of citations a researcher gets like across all of his papers is like 180. So this is you see papers like this that are old, they've been cited thousands of times. That's because they're holding up. They're still good. They're still so influential that people continue to cite them. It's not the case that because a study's old, you don't want to cite it. That is occasionally taught to undergraduates, though. Like don't find the old studies. Try to find something new. But these are old studies that are getting replicated. It's not the case that it's just like you can dismiss it because it's old. That's the question, is like, did it hold up to the test of time or not? Some old things do, and they do very well in that sense. Another old study here, we'll go on kind of to the next one. Clark and Hatfield initially. I think this was also originally done in 1989. What is the Clark and Hatfield research line?
So this can be described as a would you have sex with a stranger study, where they ask university students at first, would you have sex with a stranger? And you find that I think like 70% of men said yes immediately, and 0% of women said that they would. And this illustrates the kind of the different sex psychologies in desire for sexual variety and for immediate access to sex. Other data points that kind of point to the same thing is the number of sex partners men and women report to want over the lifetime, how quickly men and women agree to want sex, how easily they'll have sex without love. There's lots of converging lines of evidence of men's greater readiness for sex. And I'd point to two papers. One academic paper written by David Buss and David Schmidt in 2011, and it was about whether evolutionary psychologists could ever be feminist. And it was published in the journal Sex Roles, which is kind of a feminist journal, and it talks about this large degree of sex differences. And they've got one table, chock-a-block full of evidence. It's just so powerful. Alternatively, maybe for free access for any listeners who don't have an academic email or something like that, a Psychology Today article by David Schmidt, kind of relaying these findings to lay audience, talking about would you have sex with a stranger. One fundamental flaw in the way Münecat kind of represented this research, she kind of suggested that this is all because of women's greater fear of violence and pregnancy. Unintentionally, perhaps, she's actually pointed to the evolutionary rationale for why there would be such a sex difference at all, where we would predict that women would have a reluctance to sex with a stranger. But in those studies, they actually followed on with studies, the same authors, Clark and Hatfield, followed on with studies controlling for stigma, controlling for sexual pleasure, controlling for pregnancy, controlling for reputational damage, controlling for everything you can imagine. And it's still men way more inclined to have sex with a stranger. It's a massively robust finding, and it's kind of disingenuous, or perhaps she didn't know that they actually did control for those things in later studies. But it's absolutely not just a difference of, oh, well, women are in greater fear. Well, first of all, they're in greater fear for an evolutionary reason, but yeah.
Yeah, so even controlling for all of these other things that could be sort of standard social science model explanations for that, the sex difference still persists. And I think, even if you just ask men and women, like, do you want to do this, all things being equal? That's kind of the responses that you're going to get. And I know she mentioned, like, she doesn't necessarily believe survey data, which is also kind of parallel to the Manosphere. A lot of people seem to question this. They seem to say, ask women. You should just ask women what they want. A lot of this is doing that, and women will just tell you, and it's not that unintuitive or controversial that women do not want to have sex with strangers, and men kind of do.
Yeah, but there's survey data, there's behavioral data. Men buy sex more often, they have more affairs, there's so much triangulated data on this one phenomenon that it's remarkable that survey data could be dismissed. You could lose all the survey data and still come to this conclusion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because the Clark and Hatfield research is not survey data. They sent experimenters to school campuses to approach people and ask them. So they're saying, what do people actually do? Well, that's what you see. That's what they actually do. The sex difference in this was remarkably large, particularly in the original few Clark and Hatfield ones. I think it was a Cohen's d of like 3, where you get like almost all of the men saying, yeah, I'll do it, I'll go home with you, and like 0% of the women. It was really quite remarkable there. So yeah, kind of, like you said, she kind of unintentionally gave the evolutionary explanation for that. Why are women not likely to have sex with a stranger? Fear of violence, fear of pregnancy. I mean, pregnancy is an evolved function. She's giving the evolutionary explanation for it. It's like, why are women afraid of pregnancy? Because they can get pregnant.
Yeah, but importantly, this kind of talks about that, or it points to that evolutionary mismatch, that even controlling for those things in the current environment, because of our ancestral environment of this being a strong selection pressure, women will retain the psychology of being reluctant. You can't just say, take for example men's greater sexual jealousy too. You could be given assurances to any man, oh don't worry, your partner had sex with another man, but they use protection, your paternal certainty is totally shored up, don't worry. They're still not going to be going for that. They'll still hate that. That will be visceral response of jealousy. So yeah, the past explains the present, where our mind evolved to these selection pressures, and that's how we operate.
Exactly, yeah, and that's an important thing, is that a lot of these psychological processes and dispositions are not necessarily conscious in that sense. So it's not necessarily the woman is thinking like, oh, I might get pregnant, and then all of a sudden she's on birth control, and now she's saying, oh, I'm just going to have sex with strangers because I'm on birth control, I can't get pregnant. That persists, so it's not necessarily a conscious thought, is it?
Yeah, and you will have a small effect of the proximate, oh, I'm on birth control, I'm actually free more to have more casual sex, and you probably will find a small effect, but yeah, we're largely, you'll never completely diminish that sex difference. It's such a fundamental, large biological difference between men and women. The psychological difference in correspondence to that will be large too.
And sex differences and jealousy, that's another finding that has been very well replicated. Kind of emotional infidelity, sexual infidelity. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So again, the best way to describe this is with a kind of a rhyme of mama's baby, papa's maybe. So throughout ancestral history, ancestral men could never be sure that their offspring was really theirs. Every woman who has a child knows for sure that offspring is theirs. It's coming out of their body. It can't be anybody else's. But men could never be sure. The only way they could be sure was to vigilantly guard their mate and be extremely jealous, to pick up on cues that she may be mating with someone else. And, you know, that is a sex-differentiated selection pressure. Women, on the other hand, needed to be more attuned to emotional infidelity, because that is more of a greater cue to misdirecting resources towards someone else and their offspring. Now, women don't like sexual infidelity either, because it's often a cue to emotional infidelity too, but men are actually capable of having a lot of infidelity that isn't actually emotional in nature. Doesn't tend to be typical for women. Of course, some will be able to have those type of affairs, but typically women's sexual infidelity follows an emotional infidelity too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's perhaps one of the more blackpilling, so to speak, features of male infidelity, is that men might cheat more, even if the relationship is kind of good, even if they have high relationship satisfaction. And certainly, so another thing you mentioned there, as far as behavioral data, yeah, you see it in who visits sex workers, who signs up to Ashley Madison or something like that.
Yes.
You know, it's typically men in that case. So it's not necessarily the case. I think a lot of people find evolutionary psychology to excuse men's behavior, but that's not what it's intended to do. At the same time, a lot of people find it, once they look into it, a little bit blackpilling for women in that sense because of some of these things.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
So aside from that, there's also a preference for nulliparity as well. What is that?
So nulliparity refers to women who are kind of sexually viable, but have not been pregnant yet. And that would have been very important. So ancestral men had not only a preference for youth, but a preference for nulliparity too. Because I've been reading lately, actually being a woman's first sexual partner was very, very important in the ancestral environment, because in the ancestral environment, without birth control and without modern medicine, women, once they started having sex, were often pregnant or lactating. So there wasn't much time after that first sexual access to actually get in there. So that nulliparity is very important, and this idea of sexual reproductive value, so your whole reproductive career ahead of you, that would be the optimal time to secure a mateship with somebody, because if you can keep her as your own, you will have the optimal chance of producing most offspring with her. Now, this is not, just to get back to this idea of Münecat kind of lampooning the idea of people consciously thinking of these things. Men and women don't think about these evolutionary goals. We don't come with goals to have so many offspring. We just come with the goal of having greater sexual desire for fertile looking mates. And over ancestral time, sex with those mates rather than infertile mates led to greater fitness. So the way I would describe it is, modern men aren't queuing up outside sperm banks, even though they know that would be a great way to improve your fitness. but you still have the desire for sex. Or even people who desire to not have children, they very rarely shut down their sexual desire along with it. So it's not like these things are conscious. We're not conscious of a lot of what we do, but the ultimate goal of why we have those drives is not always doesn't always loom large in our mind when we're thinking like this.
Yeah, that's important because kind of at the beginning when she's going through her skit, she makes it sound like men and women are thinking about consciously all of these things. Really, we just see people and we think like, I like them, I don't like them. But it's not random who we like. It's based on certain traits, and we can observe those traits objectively, and we can quantify them. We can count the numbers and see like, oh, these are traits that people kind of tend to like, and then we can say, why do they like those traits? Yeah, once again, the theory of evolution provides a good explanation for why. Something that maybe doesn't is just like the standard social science model, culture in general. So take sex differences and jealousy, for example. What is the cultural or blank slate explanation for those? Explanation.
I don't know. And could you teach women to be more sexually jealous and men to be more emotionally jealous? Mooncat seems to think so. I'm not sure. I don't think so. I think that's not the way to do it. Just to pick up on something you said there, Alex, about, you could observe the mate preferences and then come up with the reason why. You could also reverse order that and say, what are selection pressures? And I wonder, are mate preferences in correspondence to that? So I'll give you an example of a recent one discovered from a guy called David Lewis, who used to be in our lab at UT. He discovered male preference for a specific type of angle of lumbar curvature on the back. And the way he did it was a very good example of the way evolutionary hypotheses are kind of formed and how we search for evidence. So he figured the adult human female is the only species on planet Earth that has the adaptive problem of carrying a fetus while they're pregnant on 2 feet while standing up. Most other species are kind of down on all fours or whatever. So that creates a specific selection pressure for adult human women to have a strong kind of spine that's optimal for carrying this pregnancy while on 2 feet. So as such, women have a different type of spine. They have a kind of wedged in third vertebrae up, different to men. So he thought, this is a strong selection pressure on women. I wonder then, would men have a preference for a specific type of spine, and what type of spine and lower back would they like? He consulted with surgeons to ask them, what is the optimal distance between hyperlordosis and hypolordosis? So the optimal distance from too much slant and too little slant. And they said it would be about 45.5 degree angle. And guess what male preferences for the lumbar curvature are? 45.5 degree angle. So remarkable. Even in moving figures, they've found this preference. So similar to the waist-hip ratio kind of thing, that even blind men have this preference, this is a deeply evolved thing. But it just kind of shows you the evolutionary hypothesis in that case was reverse engineered. It was, well, what is the adaptive problem? You should have mate preferences in correspondence to that. He didn't even know if men did. He just made the prediction and found out, yes, they did. And that's the power of the theoretical framework.
Exactly, and that's very, very important. And that's the way it really needs to be done, because that's the opposite of a just so story. You have your hypothesis, you have your theory, it helps you generate the hypothesis, then the hypothesis is tested. Because you can look at preferences and be like, okay, that kind of makes sense, and maybe you get it right. But it's when you come up with that first, and then you test it, and you're saying, okay, you can't be accused of a just so story in that case.
Yeah, so evolutionary psychology creates predictions a priori, so ahead of time. And David Lewis, the same researcher, actually wrote a really powerful article along with some other co-authors from our lab, a previous generation of our lab, called a how-to guide for evolutionary psychology. And it's really, really good because it talks about how the hypotheses are generated, how they're not just so stories, and how to do it properly, how to look for cultural variation. And fundamentally, evolutionary psychology predicts where you will find cultural variation. A fundamental misunderstanding of evolutionary psychology is that we just think about universality, that humans are the same everywhere. Absolutely not. If you give us enough information about the ecology, the sex ratio, parasites in the environment, we can make predictions about how cultures might vary in their psychology. Again, ahead of time.
Yeah. So there are some cultures. Is it the Hadza that has a very large extra pair parenting rate?
I think Hadza or Himba.
The Himba.
Himba.
There we go. Yeah, I was
Brooks Skelza does it. Yeah, Himba.
So you can look at these cultures that are not weird samples, that are very distant, that have very high rates of extra pair paternity or polygamy or something. You still kind of see these sex differences and jealousy as well. You still see sexual conflict and all of these similar things, which kind of seems to say, okay, even if you have a culture that is it would be ideal in this culture if you did not experience any jealousy or sex differences in jealousy. You still see the exact same kinds of conflicts.
Yeah, very difficult to kind of erase it. And even in terms of parental investment, there are examples of hunter-gatherer societies where the belief is, the cultural belief is that there is shared paternity. So every man that the woman has had sex with is partially the father. And it's kind of adaptive because it diminishes that sexual jealousy and kind of everyone invests a little bit in the offspring. But guess what you find? That the actual father, the actual biological father, invests more heavily, infrequently. So, yeah.
So something else she mentioned was kind of this Eurocentric beauty standards, because of course we're talking about mate preferences, and overlapping with mate preferences is a lot of research on attractiveness. That was one of my original interests that kind of got me initially into that, and then I realized like, oh, I cannot even study attractiveness without running through evolutionary psychology. So she kind of says these are Eurocentric preferences, and I think a lot of people have kind of the perception that like in other cultures the preferences are totally different. What do you think about this Eurocentric beauty standards thing?
Absolutely not. There's a large degree of consensus, particularly around female beauty, around what is a beautiful woman. You could take a group of hunter-gatherer men, Australian men, UK men, American men from different times, and they'll largely agree on who is an attractive woman and who's less attractive. Male attractiveness is less, it's more subjective. It's based on different things. There are some features like height that are, unfortunately for me, very important to women. But female beauty is very much linked to cues of health, youth, and fertility, because we inherited these preferences from ancestors who successfully reproduced, and those were the ones who had preferences for fertile mates, and we use youthful-looking cues as cue to that fertility. There are some cultural and temporally variable preferences like plumpness versus thinness, and it's associated with status. So sometimes in a particularly harsh environment, you might prefer a plump mate because it kind of implies that she has enough resources or is not struggling. Whereas in other high resource environments, it might be more high status to be very slim because you can afford to go on a diet or whatever it might be. But what's never reversed is the waist-hip ratio. And that's a big cue to youth and fertility, is this narrow waist relative to wider hips. And this is seen in evidence into antiquity. So even art from thousands of years ago depicts this narrow waist, wider hips. It's so strong that men all over the world prefer it, even blind men. When you actually get them to measure and what do they feel, what do they actually like, they like this waist-hip ratio. And again, this was one of the findings that Münecat seemed to kind of thumb her nose at. And this is not Eurocentric. No one is imposing Eurocentric white kind of beauty standards on hunter-gatherer societies who find these things beautiful. So it doesn't make sense. And, this idea of a universal human nature in general is that's a fundamental kind of a good universalism idea for humanity. I think it's a common human nature with each other rather than anything Eurocentric. So
yeah. A lot of what I've written about and researched was on attractiveness, and facial attractiveness in particular, other signs of attractiveness, they're very cross-culturally robust, and a lot of this research wanted to get at that. Like, is it cultural? If it's cultural, we should see very different preferences, but we actually see very similar preferences. In the case of something like adiposity as well, what you described there, so this can shift based on status. Is that not also what we would expect from kind of the evolutionary hypotheses, predictions there?
Absolutely. Yeah, you could make that prediction if you have enough information about the ecology. What is it like? What is a cue to status? You can make predictions based on that, for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And status cues actually are also very robust. I think David Buss did a large cross-cultural study on status cues, and you see the same kinds of things there, like high intelligence, signs of education, cooperativeness, and then you see all of the antisocial traits at the bottom, like what really hurts your status, like being a liar or uncooperative and that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and with the mate preferences, it's like these are totally not arbitrary. Like, yes, there's some variation in what people prefer a little bit, but there's nobody who prefers skin with lesions all over them and kind of bad breath, crooked teeth. Nobody prefers that. No. That's just, it's not, and I think for female beauty in particular, using health, youth, and fertility as your kind of guiding heuristic, that can be tremendously informative.
Yeah. To clarify for everyone, I mean, the correlation specifically for facial attractiveness across cultures, they're like 0.8, 0.9. There's really high agreement on what faces are attractive.
Yeah, huge.
What else was I going to say in respect to this? As far as did she mention that woman of Willendorf figure in the video? I'm not sure if she did.
I think I saw it pop up.
So of course I'll put a picture of this up. This is a old artifact, the woman of Willendorf, and a lot of people point to this and they say, this is an example that very high adiposity was attractive in the past, but we know almost nothing about this. We don't know if this was, a goddess figure, if this was actually attractive to people, or whatever the case may be. It seems that a lot of people kind of defer to these explanations that we really don't know that much about, that can be just those stories in their own sense.
Of course, Alex, according to Mooncat, we can't know anything about the past anyway. So yeah, they may have been just creating this figure and kind of laughing at her as a grotesque image, but probably not. It's probably that waist-hip ratio. She's an example of it, the Mrs. Willendorf herself. She's got a great waist-hip ratio.
Yeah, that's the thing. And with waist-hip ratio, I think a lot of people don't know that as well, that you can have, have higher adiposity, be fatter, and have that good waist-hip ratio, or be slimmer and have that good waist-hip ratio. It's the ratio that's really important, perhaps more than the level of adiposity.
Yes, so example of that is plus-size model Ashley Graham. Looks fantastic. Is larger lady, but has that ratio. And then even the stick-thin figure Victoria's Secret models, they still have that ratio. It's not like they're just boxy figures. It's always that ratio.
Exactly, yeah. So she talked about the replication crisis a little bit. Certainly the replication crisis is something that occurs across psychology, and not just in psychology, but across pretty much anything that has to do with studying human beings. We're saying about half of these papers don't replicate or anything. Mm-hmm. So she's kind of singled out evolutionary psychology in that sense, perhaps unfairly, as like saying, this doesn't replicate. We'll go into that a little bit in another slide as well. And we've talked about this extensively. So sex difference research remains among the most well-replicated research in psychology. She gave examples of like ovulatory shifts and spatial rotation. I'm not sure why she focused so much on spatial rotation, because that does actually seem to replicate the sex difference. And we'll go into that as well. But I put up here a list. These are also psychological adaptations that have replicated very well. Okay, so the behavioral immune system. Just brief explanation. Do you know what that is? Behavioral immune system.
So your behavior will, you kind of have an immune system behaviorally that you will learn to not go near environments that are highly pathogenic, because that's dangerous. So your behavior will act as an immune system buffer for your biological system.
Sure. Bitter taste aversion. So yeah, we are averse to bitter things. Why? Probably because they're poisonous often, that sort of a thing. Core disgust, we talked about this a little bit. Disgust sensitivity, aversion to pathogens, right? Mm-hmm. That kind of a thing. Essence categorization.
She actually almost even suggested at one point in the video, I just remember, that maybe our ancestors weren't aversive to pathogens. Maybe it was just sheer luck. Yeah. And is it really likely that we just, by sheer luck, got here with an inherited aversion to pathogens? Or is it likely that our ancestors who had an aversion to pathogens passed on their genes more? That is how traits are inherited. We inherit the traits from our previous generation. That seems to be lost. It seems to be like that it couldn't be actually in response to a selection pressure, that it has to have been just this messy accident spaghetti at the wall kind of thing. I don't know about that view of evolution.
She said that kind of spaghetti at the wall. What did she mean by that, do you think?
I'm not quite sure. I think it's just that I think she's trying to make the claim that anyone who tries to give structure to evolution as if it's kind of guided in some way is kind of suspect. She's kind of preferring to see it as just this messy, it just all whatever sticks, we don't know, evolution is just a messy bitch, she called her. And it's not quite that way, because traits are selected and are retained in response to the environment. So it's not just a complete arbitrary whatever passes on to the next generation happens to pass on to the next generation. Certain things are passed on to the generation because they were better adapted to that environment.
Precisely, yeah. I think a lot of people in the past used to think of evolution as very, very random because mutations are random. But the process of evolution and what's selected for is not necessarily random.
Yes.
In that case. There is kind of a rationale and a reason to that. But so on this slide, these are a lot of things that are very, very well replicated. Preference for sweet-tasting foods, that's something from evolutionary psychology there. It's probably not what people are thinking of when they're thinking of like mate preferences and like, why did we evolve oral sex or whatever? The fear of snakes is another big one, right? So snakes as a prepared stimulus, for example, you can, this was learned very early in research on classical conditioning, even before there was kind of an evolutionary explanation for it, Seligman and that kind of a thing. Why is it so much easier to acquire a fear of snakes, right? You pair a picture of a snake with an electrical shock, then you present the fear of snake. Wow, you have a higher physiological response. Well, snakes are dangerous. These things just make so much sense. They're well confirmed, well replicated.
But cars are very dangerous too, but you can't elicit such a fear.
But you can't with cars. That's exactly it. It doesn't work with other things in the modern environment that are dangerous. They don't work as that kind of prepared stimulus.
We don't have a deep ancestral history of a selection pressure causing us to be afraid of cars. Perhaps if long enough down the line we would develop one, but they're pretty new.
So she talks about just so stories a little bit. I guess, the alternative for a lot of this, specifically with sexual behavior and preferences, is kind of just like patriarchy, right? But it seems to me like patriarchy is also kind of a just so story. What do you think about that, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty nebulous kind of catch-all theory that's used to explain phenomenon. And I would point to this idea that there's some facts about modern sexual psychology that don't quite fit with patriarchy theory. So the gender equality paradox. Sex differences in some sexual psychology areas are larger in less patriarchal areas. That is just the precise opposite of what you would predict if you're saying that these sex differences are largely driven by patriarchy. Less patriarchy should reduce those sex differences. That makes sense on the evolutionary view, not on the standard social science model view.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's always seemed to be the case that patriarchy is a bad explanation for individual differences and that kind of a thing. It's certainly a macro explanation for society. You can look at a society where men dominate everything or in positions of power, and you can describe that society as a patriarchy, and that's probably pretty accurate, right? You can say, I'm giving it, a description to society, it's patriarchal, great. But as far as like patriarchy shaping individual differences, why are some women higher in sociosexuality? Why are some women lower? There's no instrument that measures patriarchy. There's no patriarchy scale. It's really rarely operationalized in psychological research. But somehow it's become to be very, very popular when really it's just kind of a subjective description of like a society we live in. It's more sociology than psychology in that sense. But another topic I think that she mentioned there was kind of the exclusive homosexuality paradox. What is that?
Yeah, so that is an evolutionary puzzle of there's lots of same-sex sexual behavior throughout the animal kingdom, and a recent paper found that it is adaptive because it increases pro-social behavior among same-sex individuals in that species. So you would think, oh yes, well humans must have a relic of that too. But what is a puzzle is the exclusive homosexuality. So some humans are exclusively attracted to the same sex, and that does seem to be uniquely human and an evolutionary paradox. But like Charles Darwin, we shouldn't be afraid of these puzzles. We should try and engage with them. And it is difficult to explain some aspects of modern human sexuality, but there are some theories. Some have found good support, some have found less support. One is like the fraternal birth order effect, where the more older brothers you have, the more likely you are to be homosexual. Lots of these theories, but she seemed to suggest that the idea of having multiple theories, she kind of laughed at the idea that, oh, there's 10 evolutionary theories and none of them are any good. It's like, that's how you find the truth, is you keep actually trying to find evidence for your supported theory. That's, again, normal science.
Yeah, I hope she comes up with some theories of her own.
Right,
to
yeah.
do it. If she thinks all of the evolutionary hypotheses are bad and the evolutionary theory doesn't explain anything, I mean, it doesn't seem to be the case that all of these standard social science models do either. So maybe she will figure it out herself and make a video on it.
Yeah, one thing there is a good, I think, evolutionary explanation for is an even bigger puzzle of homophobia. So on the evolutionary view, you would think as a man, it would actually be very adaptive for other men to be gay. Because you would say, oh, less competition for me, they're not interested in women, this is fantastic. But men are very homophobic, more so than women. And one evolutionary explanation is this coalitional psychology that's going on, coalitional value theory, I think it's called, whereby it's actually femophobia, that it's the effeminate, more camp gay men that are more victims of homophobia. And there's a lot of evidence to point to this, that it's seeing a effeminate gay man is seen as less value as a coalitional partner in our ancestral history of war. We find that homophobia is most pronounced among men rather than women, directed at men rather than women. It is most common in groups of strong coalitional thinking like team sports, military, the police, strong homophobia. And if you think about it as a coalitional partner, a feminine man in your tribe was perhaps very costly to you. And also what was very costly to you is someone who might be gay. When going to war, was one of the main motives for that was to acquire mates. So if you that maybe explains the homophobia. It's like, I can't motivate this guy to go to war with me. He's not that interested, you know. So that, again, the evolutionary line of thinking leads to some explanations of an otherwise a puzzle. I guess everything else would just be just a just so story of, oh, people are homophobic because they're taught to be, or I don't know.
They just are, no explanation. There's it's also interesting that insults like that also kind of target traits that are valuable in men. So a very, very common insult, one of the top ones is, you know, calling another man gay or something like that. So what does that do? It devalues that man in the eyes of other men and also in the eyes of women, like, oh, he's not a viable partner for you. So a lot of the insults that we have also kind of reflect an evolutionary history. We're insulting the traits that are found valuable by the opposite sex to kind of lower their mate value in that sense.
Yeah, so women derogate each other's promiscuity most often because that's seen as valuable to men. So, you know, it can be informative about that. But even the same-sex aggression, the intrasexual competition, was something that Münecat seemed to laugh at, which I didn't quite understand that either. It's like finding an explanation for intrasexual competition seems like a worthy mission. I don't know, what's her explanation for same-sex aggression?
I have no idea. But it's interesting because a lot of the researchers that she pulled up, interviews with Chris Williamson or Jordan Peterson, these are a lot of women that are evolutionary psychologists, as well as the research that she was kind of making fun of on intersexual competition and all of that. I think the top researcher in that field is Joyce Benenson, also a woman in that sense. It doesn't seem to be the case that this is necessarily a field dominated by men. Certainly psychology broadly is about 70% female. Is your experience at these conferences and everything mostly women? Or?
No, it seems to tack on to the kind of trend in general psychology, more women these days than men. But throughout the recent decades, there's been fantastic female evolutionary psychologists. Joyce Benenson looks from an evolutionary view, Tanya Reynolds, Jamie Krebs, Diana Fleischman. There's tons. Leda Cosmides, right from the beginning, one of the founders of the field. Incredible scientist, you know.
Yeah, far from being a field dominated by old white men, it's actually quite diverse. We are a minority. We are the oppressed minority in this case. Even with the ovulatory shift research, I mean, one of the lead researchers there, Hasselton, a woman as well, right?
Yeah.
So lots of things. She mentioned as an explanation for some of these things, stereotype threat. The idea that stereotyping individuals can kind of reduce their ability. So, for example, if you've grown up in an environment that says men are good at math, women are bad at math, that's enough to kind of cause this sex difference in math performance or something like that. So she talked a lot about replication. I'll put the slide up here, but this is interesting because a lot of what she refers to as an explanation, this is coming from the standard social science model. Stereotype threat classically does not replicate. Any thoughts on that? I don't know what else needs to be said on that.
I would just say that even stereotypes themselves actually replicate quite well.
Yes, yes.
There's a researcher called Lee Jussum, and he researches the truth of stereotypes, how many are actually based on some degree of truth or reality. And he kind of made a joke to me one time that it's the easiest line of research ever because stereotypes often tend to be based on something. Like humans create stereotypes based on something. There's very few that are kind of not based on anything. One, actually, that's been debunked, a stereotype, is that women who have a lot of casual sex have low self-esteem. And actually, guess who was debunked by? An evolutionary psychologist, Jamie Krebs. So there you go.
Yeah, that one makes sense. And I feel like that was a stereotype maybe. I think sometimes these are opinions that get pushed and they're verging on a stereotype and then they don't get to that point. But yeah, some of these very broad stereotypes, they probably reflect a sort of heuristic decision making. If an effect size is large enough, it should be, you know, from Cohen's effect sizes conventions. Like if it's a medium effect size, it should be something that you can see, you know, with close observation or all of that. So it makes sense that stereotype threat, or stereotype accuracy, I should say, is one of the more well replicated things. Stereotype threat, on the other hand, not really. There's a lot else that the standard social science model has given us that doesn't replicate. So now we're kind of moving into the replication section here. If you go to this website, Replicability Index, I think that's by Šimek. How do you say his name?
Šimek, I think, yes.
You do much better with the names than I do. I'm like, how do you say this? So yeah, behavioral priming doesn't replicate, construal level theory, ego depletion, implicit bias research, which has been used, you know, very politicized as related to race and DEI and all of that. This is something as well that does not seem to replicate. Stereotype threat, as we mentioned, implicit self-esteem. So there's a lot of these, and all of these have come from the standard social science model, from the blank slate. None of these big influential theories that have actually had a pretty big impact on psychology and then have fallen to the replication crisis, none of these have come from evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, that's a point that's not made enough. Yeah, evolutionary psychology could actually be an antidote to the replication crisis.
Exactly, precisely. Another one that she mentioned in here, this is interesting because this is a newer paper. This is on the myth of man the hunter. So there was a paper published, it was in 2023, it was just last year. The myth of man the hunter, women's contribution to the hunt across ethnographic contexts. So we see big sex differences classically in hunting behavior. We see big sex differences in physical aggression, willingness to go to war, all kinds of things like this. We see this across the thing. Recent paper by these authors, they said, no, actually women hunt all the time too. They found in their paper that 79% of women hunted, 33% hunt big game. So they're kind of trying to call this into question. Like, oh, actually women hunt a lot more than was expected in Man the Hunter, which was this large ethnographic collection of observations from anthropologists that men hunt more than women do. When this came out, I immediately went through the data and I went through just all of the African countries myself, and I noticed like, oh, these are not actually lining up. The way that they coded these, in many cases, even the exact opposite of what was said in the original paper. And I wrote an article on that. And then I think it went out on Aporia. And then some anthropologists did a better paper that they published on this more recently. Yeah. So it's interesting that she would cite this because this is also something that does not replicate and has fallen to a replication very recently published right now. So it turns out basically that the results here were fake. They excluded something like 35% of forager countries. Only recoding of 50 of 63 of these found that women rarely or never hunted in 16 of 50 of those. So there was a lot of problems kind of up in the slide here going forward with that. And looking at these errors across this, many cultures with no women hunting in them were excluded. Many inclusion of women hunting where women don't hunt at all, as I kind of mentioned when I looked at the data as well. What do you think of this, kind of these sex differences in hunting behavior?
Well, I think that the kind of the methodological and interpretation of the data flaws have been well highlighted by yourself and that recent Evolution and Human Behavior paper that came out. But at a higher level of analysis here, there's a kind of a conceptual problem whereby there's certain type of people now who are kind of seeing the male default as almost better, and that there's an admirable goal to try and show that women could be just like men. So I think there's an interesting story about our ancestral environment of hunting and kind of representing women better in that. So there's a lot of evidence that many cultures, most of the calories came into the society from the foraging, and that the hunting for big game was actually a lot of status striving and just kind of big swinging dicks from the men, which may have been useful and important in creating group cohesion in and of itself. But why can't there be a difference and women's role valued and men's role valued? Other evidence I've heard of lately is that with the big hunting, women were actually quite powerful in deciding when that happened and why that happened. And it was often to say, hey, if you want to be sexually selected, you better go bring me some mammoth or bring me something. And they would send the guys out and be actually in control of when the hunts happened. Now that's very interesting. And all of that's positive retelling of the story. You don't need to massage the data into suggesting that there was no sex differences. I don't see why sex differences are automatically seen as favoring men. So, for example, men have greater desire for sexual variety. Why is the answer to that problem to say, so do women? It's not. It's fine to be different. I don't understand why it's more moral or better to say women can be just as promiscuous as men. It just doesn't make sense. I don't know why they're having this default. And you kind of even see it with modern jobs, like, CEOs, they're all men. And, that's a problem. It's like, I don't know,
Yeah, particularly a good point you made there. Yeah, in a lot of these cultures, gathering is very, very important. Foraging provides a majority of the calories, and also they're calories that are persistent, so they're every day, where hunting might become more sporadic. We really kind of devalue that role in a sense, and I'm not entirely sure why. There's probably, some status associated with it, like you said there. But that's one of the things I think that kind of drives these very motivated hypotheses. Like, we're going to go and we're going to retell kind of the myth in a sense to favor women more, even if it doesn't actually favor women more, even if the actual story there is not that like women need to hunt as much as men. It's probably more like, hey, women are doing something that's actually maybe more crucial than going off and playing. I remember when I was reading those papers, kind of recoding the data, One description of men hunting was like, it literally just said they were lazy, that they take their bow and they just go play in the woods. And it was like, okay. Well, that's maybe not what you're thinking of. Is like hunting is like, oh, it's so crucial, he's bringing back the mammoth. Well, I don't know. Mooncat, does she believe mammoths are real? Maybe she doesn't. She seems to think cavemen are very fun.
We have no way of knowing.
Yeah, we don't know if mammoths are real.
Do we interact with them? Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Total fluke if we encounter them. But it's this lionizing of the male default and minimizing of sex differences. I just don't understand it. What's the motive there?
Yeah. So certainly she's going on about replicability and all of that, and she seems to imply that replicability in evolutionary psychology is actually lower than in other things. But here is a list of journals in which we have high rates of replication versus low rates. Personality research, so research on individual differences like sex differences, that kind of a thing. Evolutionary psychology, they actually kind of have the highest replication rates here, right? We see this rankings out of 121 journals. In the top 10, what do we see? A bunch of journals from personality psychology, evolutionary psychology, and research on sex differences, right? Like sex roles is one of them, that journal. So, I mean, what do you think about that? Evolutionary psychology is not less replicable than anything else. It's probably more replicable.
Yeah, you also had archives of sexual behavior in there, evolutionary psychology itself, always consistently replicable and increasingly so, and increasingly powerful. The impact factor of our flagship journal, Evolution and Human Behavior, is on an upward trajectory. So evolutionary psychology is gaining a stronger foothold. I would just return to the woman, the hunter kind of debacle 1 second. I would be embarrassed to have endorsed that woman the hunter thing so strongly, and then when the new evidence came out about the way the data was massaged, I would want to walk that back. But I've seen no concession from any of the champions of that research. They cannot acknowledge that actually, the data didn't actually favor our theory. Unlike what evolutionary psychologists do when the data doesn't support our theories. We walk it back immediately and go for a different theory. This is a fundamental difference that should be highlighted, I think.
Yeah, it's really a difference in the way people who are very ideologically motivated think, like, this is scoring points for my team, I got it, versus people who are maybe a little bit less motivated by ideology and who are just like, I just kind of want to figure out what's going on here, and I don't really care the way that falls. I mean, that's the way I feel about a lot of this research, is like, I don't care if the ovulatory shift is real or not. I just want to know if it's real or not. I don't care if women hunt as much as men or not. I would just kind of like to know if they do or not. Yeah. So comparing across subdisciplines in psychology, I'll put this slide up here. The standard social science modeler, the blank slate, it probably has more of a replicability crisis. I mentioned a bunch of things from that were big theories that have all fallen into the replication crisis. Here's a chart that shows, I didn't look at evolutionary psychology. I think you're probably going to be the first one to do something specifically on the replicability of evolutionary psychology. But at the top of this, one of the most replicable subdomains in psychology is actually personality psychology, which personality psychology, if people don't know that is where you study a lot of sex differences. It overlaps very highly with evolutionary psychology. Like, I came into evolutionary psychology from personality psychology. That was my background there.
David Buss was a personality psychologist before an evolutionary psychologist.
Precisely. It overlaps a lot. If you're looking at, a lot of relationship behavior, things like the dark triad, personality differences, all of this is personality psychology. This has a very high replication rate. What has a low replication rate? Social psychology. That's where you're going to find all of your standard social science model stuff. Social psychology. But low replication, that's kind of what she's got going on there. 25% replication rate. So
yeah. I eagerly await the Mooncat debunk social psychology video.
Yeah, Mooncat debunks social psychology small sample sizes, which I think might actually be
and weird sample sizes. Yeah.
Oh yeah, she implied that there was kind of some academic fraud going on there. I know she mentioned the Gino affair. What's her name? Francisca Gino.
Francisca
Gino. She was not an evolutionary psychologist.
Nope.
She's an economist.
I think so. Yeah, I'm not as familiar with her background, but I know the scandal.
But she's definitely not, and her research had nothing to do with evolutionary psychology. I don't think an evolutionary psychologist has ever been caught for fraud.
I can't think of any scandal. Some people might point to the use of IQ data from the Lynn data set or something as perhaps they would consider that fraud, but there hasn't been nearly as big a scandal as this, for sure.
Yeah, people would probably call that bad methods because they, collecting samples they say are not representative or whatever. But I don't think anyone's caught them just like straight up faking data like in the Gino affair. But in social sciences more broadly, that's certainly occurred. I've put up some examples here. Eric Stewart, very famously, he was fired, I think, from the University of Florida. He created decades of fake data on systematic racism or systemic racism there. All from this year, Claudine Gay, plagiarism. Well, here's a list. I have 5 people on here who all have been kind of busted for plagiarism this year. every one of these individuals is involved in a DEI research, ironically enough, or was in a DEI administration at that point. So it doesn't seem to be the case that we're seeing a lot of academic fraud from evolutionary psychology. I can't think of an evolutionary psychologist who's actually been busted for a fraud or had their data like, you made this data up. But it does happen in some of these other fields, perhaps.
Mooncat debunks DEI?
Mooncat debunks DEI.
I don't know.
Let's see. So you did talk about these supposedly small samples and all that. Do you think evolutionary psychology uses small samples?
Precisely the opposite. Some of our seminal findings, if you go as far back as 89, large cross-cultural samples with thousands of participants. So it's like this idea, this accusation, this charge of being small, weird samples is totally not applicable, not appropriate.
Yeah, it really isn't. And I think a lot of people get confused about what a small sample is. I've written about statistics on the website a bit. So I think people are kind of confused about how a sample of 1,000 people can represent the whole U.S. population or whatever. But up on this slide, I went through all of the most recent papers published in a journal, Feminism and Psychology, and I compared them with all of the most recent samples taken from the journal Evolutionary Psychology. Okay. And so what do we see here? We see sample sizes in Feminism and Psychology 14, 24, 71, 21, 23, 112, and 18. So the average here, or the median, I guess, is 23, their sample size in this feminist psychology journal. Very small samples are very, very common in research like this that tend to be more qualitative or something like that. They're pretty common in disciplines like neuroscience as well. If you look in evolutionary psychology, on the other hand, here we have a median sample size of 356. So to compare, the average median, or I should say the medium psychology sample from this other paper here, it's only 60. Yeah. So that's about what you're working with across psychology broadly. Evolutionary psychology actually seems to be using much larger samples than we see in other fields, particularly if you begin to look at like feminist research, qualitative data. Then you're looking at like, I interviewed 10 people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the data shows it there, but yeah, who's interested in data when you can just have an ideological point?
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see if she goes back and debunks qualitative research with sample sizes of 10 as well. So the gender similarities hypothesis, she spent a little bit of time on this one as well. Probably in addition to the ovulatory shift, which she spent some time on. I think this was the only other thing she actually spent like a lot of time on. And it was from this paper by Hyde in 2005, which was 20 years ago. So old papers,
Throw it out.
I don't know what her cutoff for an old paper is. Yeah. But it was a good paper though. So the better our research, the more gender differences collapse. That's a quotation from Mooncat there that she said, the better our research, the more gender differences collapse. And she referenced this paper by Hyde. It was a review of these 46 meta-analyses. But I read this paper, and it turns out that Hyde actually found the same large sex differences in sexual attitudes and behavior that we see in evolutionary psychology. This is not a refutation. It didn't show that those gender differences collapsed. She actually said the exact same thing.
Yeah. So, yeah, the exact opposite of her prediction.
The exact opposite of what she said there. And these are sex differences in aggression is a big one, right? So sex differences in aggression, why would we expect that from the evolutionary point of view?
Well, it's not very adaptive for women throughout our ancestral environment to pursue an aggressive strategy. If it's very costly to you and your fitness as a woman, if you get injured, your fitness is likely incurs a very heavy cost. If you get injured, you struggle to take care of your offspring. If you get injured as a man, you're likely to be able to actually reproduce. Also, you have a deep ancestral history of contest competition, where men actually achieved mating success by fighting other men. There's a lot of details about our morphology, our thicker skulls and specific parts of the skull, better throwing strength, better striking strength, greater upper body strength, larger overall. I think there's some statistic like the average man is 90% more stronger than the average woman, or has 90% more upper body strength. Yeah. Huge. Then specifically again with striking, you also find a deep ancestral history of contest competition, whereby a lot of male skulls are found with blows to the left side of their head, indicating that a right-handed fighter kind of hit them a lot. Yeah. You find a conspicuous absence of fertile-aged female skulls in our ancestral environment, because women were obviously absorbed into the other tribe in wartime, whereas men were just kind of killed off. Yeah, I always say you could never have a man could never just leave his family and society and absorb into another tribe. Really, it was just killed. And you see this with chimps as well.
Yeah, absolutely. in addition to sex differences in aggression, which are very robust and well replicated, it's certainly not a personality difference that has collapsed at all. She also mentioned spatial rotation. She was talking about this, and she was kind of picking up papers here like, oh, this shows it, this doesn't. In this same paper by Hyde she referenced, you see consistent differences in spatial rotation tasks, right? And I'll just put the chart up here. It's on the same slide so people can see it. But that's actually something else that's pretty well replicable. I'm not sure why she said that wasn't replicable. Another thing she said there was throwing ability and distance. That's replicated very well. And that's also a very, very large sex difference, a Cohen's d of like 2.1, 2.2, and that sort of a thing. So you mentioned that a little bit. Throwing ability and distance. Why might that?
Yeah, so humans, one of our kind of best qualities as a group, throwing became very important to kind of outcompete other species and like kind of hunt. You could group together and wear an animal down by throwing at it. And men were responsible for most of the hunting, so they developed a far greater throwing ability. This sex difference is massive, and it emerges among 3-year-olds. So it's not to do with training, and even in the studies they've controlled for training about throwing of which maybe boys play baseball more. They controlled for all of that. Still a massive sex difference. And again, Alex, could you just really highlight how high that D is? That it is unheard of in psychology.
Sure. So a Cohen's d of 2.18. I'll put up an image for this to show how big that is. But this is the kind of size where you say, okay, you know, if you have a small Cohen's d, if you have a small difference, you can say, okay, there's a lot of overlap. You know, a lot of men are going to be like a lot of women. You start getting into Cohen's d of like two standard deviations difference. Then you see, okay, almost all men are better at this than almost all women.
Yes.
That's kind of what you're looking at. I think that's probably a good lay explanation. Mm-hmm. These sex differences in spatial abilities, throwing, right? Because here's the thing. Visual spatial abilities, rotation, mental rotation tasks, those are also related to throwing accuracy and all of that. This is, again, not just weird samples. The paper I put up here, hunter-gatherer theory of sex differences and spatial abilities, data from 40 different countries, right? Mm-hmm. So these are things that we see across culture. And like you said, even when you control for all of these cultural explanations, these persist, and they persist to be very, very large. That's basically the story there, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gender similarities argument. She said that, and that's kind of the paper there, right? That by Hyde. She said this gender similarities, basically that there's more similarities than they are different. And the reason I think Hyde said that in this is because we see sex differences across all of these different things, these meta-analyses in this paper by Hyde. We see that there's sex differences. They haven't collapsed. The meta-analyses show that. But individually, they're very small. So that's kind of what her argument was there. But it's not the case that a bunch of individual sex differences that are small don't add up to a very big difference in the overall picture between men and women.
And the specific areas where there are differences that will persist in this massive meta-analysis are the ones that fit with the different selection pressures facing each sex. So they're the ones you would expect by an evolutionary view. You would expect similarities in some of these areas of personality, that there's no real major difference or reason for there to be a difference. So
exactly, yeah. And another interesting paper, I'll just put that up on the screen real quick. Sex differences in spatial abilities persist even for experts in STEM, arts, and sports. So like you said, you mentioned that. Even controlling for these things, training, right? So even when you have people that you expect to be really good at spatial differences, really good at artistic ability, all of these things, you still see big sex differences between men and women. They still remain quite large, even among experts.
Carol Hooven wrote a great article about why men have an advantage in chess, for example, where you wouldn't really expect them to necessarily have one, but they do.
Mm-hmm. So she acted like there was some kind of consensus perhaps on sex differences, or that there was a lack of consensus, or that the consensus was that these are small. Here's another paper, I'll put it up here. Global sex differences in personality, replication with an open online data set. So she mentioned, like, what do we need to do in personality and evolutionary psychology? We need pre-registration and open data. Yeah, this has all of it. We need big samples. Yeah, we got it. This is 21,000 US participants, 31,000. And what do we see here? That overall sex differences in personality have a Malinobis distance of about 2. So I put actually the histograms, or not the overlapping histograms there up to see, so people can kind of visualize what that is. But that's when you take all of these little differences, kind of like in the Hyde paper where they're like, oh, people are more similar than not because the distances, because the differences between individual traits. When you kind of add that all up, you get a really, really big picture. And this kind of goes back to stereotype accuracy. They have a section in this, they say, implications for stereotypes. Why do we have these stereotypes, and why do they seem to be accurate? Because the differences are big enough overall in the big picture between men and women. We can easily categorize people like, that's a man, that's a woman.
Yeah, for sure. And just to pick up on it, I noticed you mentioned some of the future guidelines that she mentioned about pre-registering, making predictions before you gather the data. Evolutionary psychology does all of those things far better than most of social psychology. She also mentioned adversarial collaborations. Again, an idea championed by Corey Clark, who often uses an evolutionary view to inform her work. So, I don't know.
And another thing that she mocked, and I think we're coming kind of to the end of the video here, but some of what she mocked, that maybe is not easily palatable, but is probably not that important anyway, is actually robustly true. So here's a meta-analysis on sex differences in humor production, right? So no evidence of publication bias. What do we see here? I mean, look at the forest plot. You see that the effects are consistently in one direction, that men have a higher humor production ability than women do. That maybe that's why her video was not that funny at the end of the day. But why might that be? Why might we see this kind of a sex difference in humor production ability? What do you think?
Well, this is kind of an idea put forward by Jeffrey Miller, actually, who she had lots to say about. She might not like this, but he suggests that humor production is a very sexually selected trait, that women like it. And women will often say that humor is a very important quality that they look for in a mate. So men are going to be very maniacally driven to develop humor production and try and produce it as much as they can. It's a kind of a sign of intelligence, and perhaps controversially, maybe we get into some area of sex differences in intelligence. That might be a different video. But yeah, it's a sexually selected trait in that direction. Men don't really care whether their mate is that funny. Therefore, women, the mind of one sex shapes the mind of the other. Women are not going to need to be as funny in response.
Yeah, precisely. And again, it kind of goes back to what people often say when they, and people say this when I post results from studies or something. They'll say, you're doing all this research, why don't you just ask women? And so this humor production is not all research just based on self-reports or asking people. But if you do ask women, like, do you want someone who's funny or smart? They'll almost always say yes. They act like you're not asking women, but what do you think you're doing when you survey like 1,000 women? I mean, you're not just asking what you're asking all the women, and you're quantifying it and adding it up. So that's kind of what we have there. That is, I think, the last thing. I know there's some things in this video we didn't miss, particularly about behavioral genetics and all of that. Probably for another video, or maybe someone else can go into that. But some of that is outside of the wheelhouse of evolutionary psychology. A little bit also. It's related. It's not unrelated, but it's probably a whole other topic. I hope this kind of clarified some of the big errors and misconceptions about it, and maybe people can get a different perception. And
I would encourage you to watch kind of both videos side by side, because a cursory view of her video without actually the context, without flagging, oh, that's error, oh, that's a lie, you might actually be quite compelled by it. It's quite an emotionally compelling interview. And the reason that Alex and I decided to spend some time actually responding to this video is for two reasons from my point of view. Number one, I would usually ignore these type of things. Evolutionary psychology is miscategorized within the literature, never mind in kind of pop psychology kind of YouTubes. But this person has a very large channel, so I thought it would be useful for some of her viewers to get additional context. And secondly, there are some within the evolutionary sciences who are kind of championing this video. And that to me is as harmful a misrepresentation of our field as it would be for someone to champion Manosphere, right-wing kind of red pill pickup artist videos too. So we must challenge the misrepresentation of evolutionary psychology wherever we find it. And this is one kind of major exemplar of that.
Very good closing words there. And thank you for coming on with me and everything. I hope it's a good video for all of the people.
Now we're going to go grab a beer and jump in the bath.
Exactly. The great William Costello, guys. Talk to you soon.